So hi everyone, and welcome to the first seminar in the Theory of Computing for Fairness seminar series. So before we start, I just want everyone to know, you just saw this, but I want everyone to know that the talk is going to be recorded and it's going to be made publicly available at a later date. And I'm also going to ask people to mute themselves during the talk, and if you can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. And so today we're very excited to have Dr. Annette Zimmerman as our first speaker of the series. And so she is an assistant professor right now in philosophy at the University of York. And she's also a technology and human rights fellow at Harvard University. And her research has been focusing on the political and the moral philosophy aspects of AI and machine learning. And so today, Dr. Zimmerman is going to tell us about her work on algorithmic fairness and decision landscapes. So take it away, Annette.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for inviting me. I think it's a really exciting group of researchers, and I'm really looking forward to present some recent philosophical research that I've been doing on algorithmic fairness today. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Okay, here we go. So as you can see, the title of my talk is Decision Landscapes and Algorithmic Fairness. And I wanted to begin by telling you about a particular type of decision problem that frequently occurs both in human interactions and within the context of AI systems. So it's kind of a universal collective action problem. And so here's a quote from a British TV series called Yes Minister. These three gentlemen are talking. They say, in stage one, we say nothing is going to happen. Stage two, we say something may be about to happen, but we should do nothing about it. In stage three, we say that maybe we should do something about it, but there's nothing we can do. And finally, in stage four, we say maybe there was something we could have done, but it's too late now. So I think this is a pretty common kind of problem, and it raises really interesting and important issues for the optimization of algorithmic systems. Here are my basic claims that I want to talk about today. So firstly, much of the existing literature on algorithmic fairness, in my view, has focused on optimizing for decision quality. So assessing the quality of algorithmic decision outcomes is really important. For instance, when we look at kind of well-known examples of algorithmic bias and unfairness. But I also think that that lens that focuses exclusively on optimizing for decision quality may be insufficient for assessing algorithmic fairness overall. In addition, we have to critically scrutinize our decision landscape. This is a concept that I'm introducing for the purposes of this paper. And we'll get into the kind of higher order definition of what a decision landscape is throughout the talk. But the basic questions that I think we have to ask, in addition to questions about decision quality, are which alternative decision outcomes are available to us? And even more importantly, which alternative decision problems could and should we be solving with the help of algorithmic models? This has pretty surprising and important implications. So I think that considering decision landscapes in conjunction with decision quality has implications for the questions of whether we ought to deploy a given algorithmic tool in a given domain at all. So if optimizing for decision quality in a problem space P1 moves us further away from justice, then we should actually solve a different problem P2 instead. That may sound simple, but I think it has some pretty real-world implications for current debates on non-deployment and optimization. So here's the plan. I just want to begin by talking a little bit about the problem that many different technological choices that we make when we design and deploy systems have this normative baggage, so that they necessarily require taking a moral and political position on something, even if we're not explicitly trying to do that. So we could be aiming for moral and political neutrality and objectivity when we design and deploy systems, but we might not always achieve that because a lot of technological choices are inherently affected by the way in which our social world works. I will then introduce what I call solving the right problem, rather than just optimizing within a given problem. And in that context, I want to make 3 arguments for why scrutinizing our available decision landscape, in addition to scrutinizing decision quality, is important. So I call these respectively the benchmarking argument, the A-leaps argument, and the quality independence argument. And just to make a lot of that philosophical analysis a little bit more concrete, I'll end by making an applied example. So we'll pick a case and we'll just reason through it by picking up on a very particular type of flawed optimization, namely exploitative AI optimization. Okay, so let's start with this basic intuition that designing algorithmic systems just necessarily means making explicit and implicit choices that have ethical and political significance. So in terms of design choices, there's a fairly wide range of decisions we have to make. So for instance, we might be dealing with unstated assumptions that underpin our initial motivation for designing a particular system. We might be working with concepts that are inherently contested or fuzzy, so where it's kind of socially disagreed upon what is actually included in a given concept. So one good example for that is the concept of risk. So let's say we're designing a system where we try to assess high levels and low levels of risk. It's often contested on a social and political level what the best parameters for measuring that concept are. And then those kinds of problems trickle down, right? So when it comes to collecting and labeling data, or selecting and or adjusting decision rules, or making decisions about just how much we should abstract and idealize in a given model, all of those choices are going to be affected by ethical and political assumptions we make. So we can see, for instance, if we have kind of a standard machine learning loop, both when it comes to measurement and the training data and the model, all of that will kind of involve this kind of choice making. But then also with respect to deployment, similar problems kind of occur. So where to deploy and when to deploy, whether to deploy at all is not only hotly politically contested and kind of a fast moving legal and political question at the moment, where a lot of companies are saying, no, we're not going to deploy the system, but only for a time limited term. We're waiting for regulators to effectively regulate us. So all of these questions, I think, are just not obvious and not straightforward. There isn't a kind of clear and uncontested moral and political answer here. So we can see here that the kind of success conditions that we have to stipulate for a system to be truly fair, to be truly just, kind of have this interlink of technological considerations on the one hand and normative, so meaning ethical and political considerations on the other hand. And so there is a kind of continuous interaction, of course, between these 2 success conditions, right? Because the state of the art on a technological level advances, and that might bring up new normative questions that we then have to factor in terms of mitigating certain types of algorithmic unfairnesses. So here's a kind of basic philosophical claim on this topic. I think that if we can choose, we're automatically on the hook. So that means we're just responsible for the kinds of outcomes that AI systems bring about. So that doesn't only include developers and researchers. I think it's actually a much broader moral and political responsibility that extends to corporations as a whole, but also to public officials and governments, and ultimately also democratic constituencies, right? So as soon as we have a kind of moment of democratic participation around questions that involve deployment of AI systems, then I think democratic constituencies are also responsible for making decisions that are aligned with justice. So for instance, if we look at recent democratic deliberations around facial recognition systems, for instance, where local democratic constituencies and various cities across the United States have kind of decided in a quite bottom-up way to not deploy at all anymore. For instance, not deploy facial recognition tools in policing. That's a moment where I think democratic constituencies saw themselves as being on the hook for bad outcomes of these kinds of systems. I think that living up to that ethical and political responsibilities implies that we have a very particular kind of duty to each other. I think it's a duty of justification. And I think meeting that justification will mean answering a number of important questions. These questions aren't usually answered by existing corporations who routinely deploy tools even before they've been fully regulated and have been scrutinized for various problems. But I think ideally we should be answering questions like, what is the nature and scope of the problem we're trying to solve in the first place here? What was the goal of using AI originally for this test? Why have we started to use AI in this domain? What are we trying to achieve here? And also, importantly, how have we so far fallen short of a particular moral and political goal in this area, right? So for instance, if our initial idea was let's use AI to be more fair and more objective in this domain, and we find that actually we have certain disparities in our error rates that map onto disparities that we see on a social level between different social demographic groups, then we need to have a public moment of deliberation around the question, well, how have we fallen short of this ideal? Okay, so here's a kind of basic framework for sorting out these different kinds of concerns. So looking back at our machine learning loop where a lot of these kind of ethically and politically tainted choices occur, I think we can draw an interesting distinction here, right? So on the one hand, we could try to optimize for decision quality. So we could be looking at the kinds of problems that we've decided to solve, and we're saying, well, let's solve those problems, but let's do that in the right way. Let's really think about the ways in which we define certain categories. Let's really think seriously about which algorithmic decision rule is more fair. And so the bulk of kind of technical algorithmic fairness research has really commented on that important question. But I think we can also choose to reconsider our initial decision problem that we're trying to solve, right? So now we're asking a really different question. We're asking, well, are we solving the right problem in the first place? Or should we redefine that original decision problem? So I think that's a really important question, but I think it's also really underappreciated, but very useful in our kind of normative analysis of what algorithmic fairness actually requires. And so I think that second kind of question requires looking at what I call a decision landscape. So which alternative options do we have for solving larger scale social problems? So the basic intuition here is that in scrutinizing my decision landscape, I can basically adopt one of two strategies. So I can either choose to optimize by choosing a different kind of decision problem, or by optimizing within my decision problem that I've already chosen. And so that's the kind of domain where I'm going to ask questions like, you know, how do I make this tool more accurate? How do I make it more just? How do I make it more trustworthy, and so on? And by contrast, as we've kind of alluded to before, I can just choose to not deploy, right? So it might be unclear which values should guide me. It might be unclear how I can optimize. There might be many different reasons why I might choose to not deploy. The basic issue is non-deployment is an option that is kind of always on the table, even though people, I think, are often reluctant to adopt the non-deployment strategy. So here's an important feature of this view, and we'll return to this in much more depth later on, but just to kind of foreshadow why I think this is important. I think that we shouldn't evaluate these two strategies purely by reference to some higher order end state ideals. So I don't think it's good for us to articulate some type of conception of justice in ideal terms, and to try to approximate that ideal. I think there is a really important place for articulating such ideals. So I'm not saying let's not do that anymore, but I don't think doing that exclusively will yield decisive answers for which strategy we should in fact adopt as a matter of justice. So I think we should also evaluate these two strategies with respect to whether pursuing either strategy would actually enable us to transition towards that end state ideal in a way that is itself just. So in a way, it's a question about the path that we take towards that ideal. Now, I think actually, again, the bulk of existing research has been really focused on articulating plausible end state ideals. So if you look at kind of mathematically defined fairness metrics, a lot of them are underpinned by views on what an ideal distribution would in fact look like, right? So on the one hand, you might think, well, actually, we don't want a really demanding conception of justice. We just want equality of opportunity. And if certain inequalities arise later on, that's fine because everybody had the same chances. Or we might adopt a much more demanding conception of fairness. So another plausible end state ideal might be something like equity, right? So we kind of make our ideal of justice sensitive to existing background inequalities, and we try to even out things later on. in any case, that kind of solution, so having a view on what that solution looks like, doesn't really get us all the way to answering the question of whether we're transitioning towards these end state ideals in a way that is morally and politically objectionable or not. So even if it's realizable to approximate or even to fully achieve a particular ideal, there may be really important costs to get there. So consider it just as a basic example, the effort to create an optimally efficient police force, but to do so in its current institutional form, right? Like deployed in the current political landscape, supported by, let's say, highly accurate facial recognition technology. Here we see that articulating an ideal end state for that system, for facial recognition technology, is not sufficient, right? Because we have these contextual features that make it really, really difficult to have an, in fact, just or optimal police force, given that current institutions are already unjust, right? So we kind of need both. We need to have a view of the larger scale social ideal that we want to achieve, and then we have to have a view on the path that we should take to get to that ideal. And that might not only be a technological strategy, it might also have to include particular social reforms and changes. Okay, so my goal today is to use these kinds of intuitions to critique a blanket endorsement of the optimization strategy. I don't think that many researchers are buying into a blanket endorsement of optimization versus non-deployment. But I do think that many technology practitioners and private corporations are kind of blanket in favor of trying to optimize, even in tiny incremental steps. And so you can kind of see intuitively why one might think that, right? Because you might think, well, incremental optimization is kind of better than nothing, right? So rather than doing nothing and kind of giving up on optimization, it might be better to just try and see if we can marginally improve the technology we already have, given existing social conditions around it. And so I think often optimization is indeed permissible. And even just tiny increments of optimization might be the best option we have. I just think it's not always the case that that's true. So it's worth scrutinizing this kind of blanket endorsement. Okay, so let's look at 3 arguments why scrutinizing decision landscapes might reveal to us that actually non-deployment might be preferable to optimization. The first argument is what I call the benchmarking argument. So very simple case, we've all spent a lot of time, I assume, thinking about the compass algorithm, but it kind of easily lends itself to motivating this example. So in this kind of example, I think a lot of people might think, well, algorithmic systems get us closer to optimizing for a given normative value n, such as justice, in a given domain, so criminal justice, than human decision-making would, right? So we kind of think, well, human decision makers are so inherently flawed, they're so biased, and that obviously includes judges. We have empirical evidence that judges are more likely to give defendants a lenient sentence if they've just eaten lunch. That seems drastically unjust. So, you know, let's outsource that to algorithms, and you know, maybe it won't be perfect, but it'll be better than our currently available alternative. And so that's why this kind of reasoning is usually presented as an objection to non-deployment arguments. But I think that making that particular argument means that we're working with quite a restricted decision landscape. So the kind of decision trade-off that we have in place when we make this kind of argument is we're thinking, well, either I can use this algorithmic system or I can use a human decision maker in order to predict recidivism risk. So we're holding fixed the kind of problem P1 that we've already defined. So we've decided that in order to achieve justice within the criminal justice system, what we need to do is we need to predict recidivism risks as accurately and as fairly as possible. But of course, that's not strictly true, right? We could be solving many other kinds of problems if we hold fixed instead our ultimate goal. Right? So if we allow for flexibility in terms of defining the decision problems that we're trying to solve, then we might learn that actually in order to make our criminal justice system more just, we should look into changing mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines, right? Which is a solution that doesn't necessarily require algorithmic decision making, or which rehabilitative approaches are available to us in order to reduce recidivism risk. And so there's a whole range of different alternative decision problems, some of which may be solvable via algorithmic decision tools, but some of them might require larger scale institutional changes. And so scrutinizing that kind of whole range of options reveals to us that looking only at the prediction of recidivism risk is quite a narrow lens to put on this problem. And so philosophers have looked at similar kinds of restricted decision scenarios. I think the underpinning assumption that a lot of people have when they work with the restricted decision landscape is they say something like, we must make a decision about this problem P1. So let's decide whether we should just choose it with this tool or with this tool, right? Like which outcome should we pick? What's the best decision rule within that kind of problem space? So we can fail to explore decision landscapes, even if we're aware of alternative problems that we could be solving. The point is, we have to actually seriously try to solve these additional problems as well. Merely, being aware of the fact that we could change criminal justice institutions isn't really sufficient to fully scrutinize the decision landscape. And so, importantly here, again, philosophers have kind of analyzed these kinds of cases, and a kind of conceptual tool that we can use here to diagnose these kinds of scenarios is the notion of a crypto-normative judgment. So here's a quote from philosopher Alex Worsnip. In his work on crypto-normative judgments, he tells us about one example of somebody making such a judgment. It's the kind of person who says, it's not that I think that flying, so solving that other problem, isn't the right thing to do. It's just that flying isn't possible in these circumstances. So being susceptible to a crypto-normative judgment can mean prematurely excluding these other kinds of decision problems that we could alternatively be solving, and not seriously investigating whether we should actually redefine the decision problem we're working with. And so redefining that decision problem might actually mean let's not deploy that algorithmic tool, let's actually first adopt larger scale political changes before we feel secure enough to use algorithmic tools in that domain. Okay, moving on to the second kind of argument. So this is called the A-leaves argument. A-leaves in the philosophical debate are belief-like mental states that can move us to action even if they conflict with our explicit beliefs. So this is a kind of concept put forward by a philosopher called Tamar Gentler. The danger that I'm trying to pick up on here is that we might be making implicit, misguided assessments of the meaning of having solved a given decision problem, P1. So here's an example. There might be a kind of spillover effect associated with identifying risky individuals in a given risk scoring task. The way this looks, I think, is an agent A might believe that she's doing this one thing, so just predicting recidivism rates, but actually she's doing a whole bunch of other things. And so these are implicit beliefs, or rather A-leaves, that this agent A forms. So she now has this information about recidivism rates, and she might now adopt certain unconscious biases that might inform her future actions about what follows from the fact that we've determined these different recidivism risk rates. So I think that's a kind of clear social danger here, where we might be working with the distorted decision landscape, where we're actually overemphasizing what we're learning from having carried out a given decision task. Okay, so let's turn to the third argument, which I call the quality independence argument. So the basic view here is that our duty to scrutinize decision landscapes may conflict with our duty to optimize for decision quality in accordance with some set of plausible normative values like justice. And so that's a really tricky trade-off for us, right? Because it's often not clear if we can either choose to optimize in a given domain, but doing so will actually undermine other important values. What's the strategy we should in fact adopt? One problem that is related to that issue is the phenomenon of status quo bias. So people often prefer the kind of decision landscape that they have now. And so they will perceive alternative future decision landscapes as a loss no matter what. And so that's a kind of clear human bias, but it's really hard to get rid of that, right? So people don't like uncertainty. People prefer to stick with evaluating the decision problems that they already know. And so there might be a kind of implicit presumption against scrutinizing decision landscapes. And in turn, that might also ground a kind of implicit presumption against seriously considering deployability. Now, similarly, I think people may often prefer just less ambitious normative goals just because they often seem more feasible. And in fact, they often are more feasible, right? So I think a lot of people, when they're trying to tackle certain algorithmic unfairness problems, are thinking, well, let's identify what we can fix right now and then do that, right? We can try to fix other things later, but right now let's set ourselves a feasible goal. And even if that's just kind of a marginal increase in optimality, you know, so be it, at least we've improved things in some domain. Now, all of that might really prevent us from achieving or even approximating these all things considered normative ideals. And so that may delay or even complicate our pursuit of these goals in the long term. More worryingly, perhaps, we sometimes don't even know if it's feasible at all to achieve ideals. So the question of whether we should maybe change our ideal goals in light of particular feasibility constraints that arise. So I might often try to start optimizing in a given decision problem, and I might then encounter certain roadblocks that actually might make me think, let's not try to further optimize for this initial goal that we articulated. Actually, we should be optimizing for a different ideal instead. Now, this is a major debate in political philosophy. We can dive into that debate a little bit more deeply, but here's how I think it applies in a very concrete way. So let's say I have this kind of decision problem in mind. Again, let's call it P1. And I have these different possible ideal normative goals that I can try to optimize for. Some of these goals are going to be, you know, kind of easy gets. So something like N1. These are often quite modest goals, so they're not fully optimal, but they're within reach. They're really close to us in a way. They won't require many resources, they won't require much effort. And so then in contrast, we have other goals that are perhaps even less optimal, something like N2. And then we have these big goals like N3, right, where we really make a huge jump in terms of achieving greater justice in a really meaningful sense. We might also have some goals that are just not feasible at all. So something like N5, where we're just dead sure that there's no possible way we can optimize tools in order to achieve those goals. And there might be these complex N4 types of goals where we're not quite sure if they're totally and feasibly really difficult. So where it's actually contested just how realistic these goals are. And how much time it would take to optimize for them, right? So which path we should take towards them. Now, let's say we're quite modest in our strategy. Let's say we're just choosing to optimize for N1 first. We're saying, okay, well, that's a kind of easy win for us. But sometimes what happens in a decision sequence, and we saw that in the dialogue that we started with, is other goals become less achievable as a result. So sometimes choosing to optimize for a much more modest goal in the beginning might render it infeasible down the line to actually achieve these really big normative goals. And then the only available option to us is actually a goal that looks really suboptimal, like goal N2. By contrast, if we had waited and decided to optimize first for decision goal N2, that bigger social goal might have still been available to us, but it kind of required a path that didn't involve incremental optimization at each step. We actually were suboptimal for some time, and now the big goal is available to us. And of course, you might think, well, if we had scrutinized our decision landscape from the get-go, maybe there would have been an additional different decision problem, let's call it P2, And if we had chosen to try to solve that problem, it would have been even easier to achieve that bigger social goal straight away. So that's why scrutinizing this kind of decisional landscape reveals that both kind of shifting the decision space might ultimately be more optimal for us, but also that sometimes incremental optimization might foreclose really valuable options in the long term. So the basic intuition here coming out of this particular argument is that if optimizing for decision quality in a problem P1 ends up moving us further away from justice, we should solve a different problem P2 instead. So here's a kind of clear and another very familiar example that has been much discussed in recent literature and also in public discourse. So looking at the particular example of a facial recognition tool that claims to infer behavioral characteristics from facial data exclusively. Many have argued that that is the kind of tool that is actually objectionable for intrinsic or expressivist reasons. So the thought here is, well, just using that tool is inherently objectionable because it's going to express something that has historical negative baggage. The analogies that people were drawing for this particular case was the historical experience of phrenology and eugenics. And so continuing to use a tool that seems to rely on making a similar inference may be objectionable for these symbolic reasons, right? No matter how accurate that tool is. So you might say, well, you know, can we improve that tool in some ways, and will that make it morally and politically unobjectionable? No, these people argued because it still expresses a harmful message. But you might now wonder, well, what about the kinds of AI systems that aren't like that case, right? So not all AI tools are tainted by historical baggage in quite the same way. But here I want to argue that the path that we take towards optimizing these other seemingly innocuous tools can also be morally and politically objectionable. So I just want to make an example here that I've been looking at more closely. This is an example of exploitative optimization, but this is not an example that explains all different kinds of objectionable optimization. So I think that there are many different reasons why we should be cautious when we optimize. So many different kinds of moral problems arise. This is just one example that demonstrates one possible way in which AI optimization may fall short of really important ethical goals. And so again, for this case, let's actually stick to a facial recognition case, albeit a slightly different one. So of course, we know from really important research, including research by Joy Guillermini and Timnit Gebru, that there are massive racial and gender disparities in facial recognition tools. And so in response, there was this really interesting cascade of kind of public and private sector responses. So as I mentioned before, of course, multiple cities have decided to ban the use of this technology in law enforcement. But then also interestingly, private corporations said, we're going to pause deploying this, please regulate us. I thought that was a really interesting case, given that those were very time-limited moratoriums and only in response to major pressure. But in any case, there were these kinds of two-tier responses, both from governments and citizens and also from the private sector. But of course, not everyone had that same response, right? So not everyone decided to just simply not deploy in this particular domain. So I guess a kind of natural question that arose in that context is, what if we could just optimize those tools, right? What if we get rid of those racial and gender disparities so that its deployment would not lead to these unjust outcomes anymore? It's a kind of natural intuition. The background assumption here is that optimization ultimately would benefit everybody, right? It would benefit people who are not socially oppressed, but it would also benefit people who experience massive racial and gender injustice at the moment. So it seems like a natural kind of win-win. So Google had a subcontractor tasked with improving a particular facial recognition tool. The concern there was, well, people of color are underrepresented in the database, so we need to get more data. And so the way in which this was done by the subcontractor was to approach economically vulnerable people, including homeless people in LA, and to record their facial data. This was done in a really worrying way. So what happened was that people were offered very small economic incentives, including $5 gift cards, and often deceptive tactics were used to obtain this kind of data that was needed for optimization. Many times people were told, well, this is a selfie game or just a survey. It wasn't clearly communicated that actually the purpose was to optimize this database. Okay, so let's think about why exactly this is a case of exploitative optimization. If you're already convinced that this is exploitative, great, I agree with you. If not, I have some philosophical resources for you that dive deeper into what makes an act exploitative. So in general, political philosophers can be grouped in many different camps on this issue. So some political philosophers think that all acts that involve unfair advantage taking or exploitation. There are other accounts as well, though, that focus more on the aspect of degrading or dehumanizing acts. So I think actually these two views are broadly compatible. I think we can be pluralists about this issue. I don't think we need to necessarily commit to one of them. Here's a kind of reason why I think that. So Ruth Sample, a philosopher who has advocated for that second view, said, exploitation involves interacting with another being for the sake of advantage in a way that degrades or fails to respect the inherent value in that being. It is this lack of respect that explains the badness of exploitation. I think even in this quote, the thought about unfair advantage taking is already present alongside the kind of degrading or dehumanizing aspect. So I think we can combine these views to really get a full explanation of why exploitation is objectionable. Now, of course, many different types of exploitations kind of straightforwardly harm exploitees. So the basic structure of this kind of case is A exploits B by taking an unfair advantage of B or by degrading B in some way, and that harms B. But I think it's important to realize that in real life, actually not all exploitative scenarios are exactly like that. I think it's important to remember that an action can be morally and politically wrong, even if these actions do not immediately result in harm for the exploitee, all things considered. Now, again, philosophers have really focused on this second type of case, which we might call mutually beneficial exploitation. So Joel Feinberg called this freedom-enhancing coercive offers. And so here's an example to kind of motivate the idea that even if both parties benefit, exploitation is going on. It's called the Lecherous Millionaire case. So in this kind of case, we're assuming that B has a child, and that child will die unless she receives really expensive surgery for which the state just won't pay. And so then there's A, our prospective exploiter, and A is a millionaire, so he proposes to pay for the surgery if B will agree to become his mistress. And so, of course, in this example, both A and B would derive some benefits from this arrangement. However, it seems like A is really using his advantaged position to derive a benefit that he otherwise wouldn't get. And so it seems like there's still advantage taking and possibly also degradation going on in this case, right? So that's why exploitee B in this example is still wronged. So again, even though there's a lot of pluralistic views on exactly what makes mutually beneficial exploitation wrong, many different philosophers who have advocated really different positions actually agree that mutually beneficial exploitation is a thing. So a lot of people in the field agree that exploitation must not necessarily be harmful in order to count as objectionable. So Bob Gooden, for example, says, it is not altogether clear that the exploited party's loss is a necessary condition of exploitation. And so Joel Feinberg and Ruth Sample also have said things along these lines. So that kind of basic argument is shared. But so let's apply these kinds of thoughts to our AI optimization scenario with the Google subcontractor. So looking at these different philosophical accounts of exploitation, we can see that actually it doesn't matter whether you think that exploitees in that case were harmed or not. So irrespective of that harm question, exploitation was going on, right? So the kind of wrongfulness of that strategy, that optimization strategy, is quite clear in this case. So the intuition here is that even if optimization is ultimately good for everyone, so it might be good for people who are in socially oppressed positions, because you might think, well, you know, if we can reduce these disparities across socio-demographic groups, that's at least going to be a marginal improvement for them, even if there's some remaining injustice. But so even if we think that we have these kind of mutual benefits, we may still have really strong moral and political reasons, namely reasons of justice, to seriously consider whether we should just not deploy and optimize, including, but not necessarily limited to, these kinds of cases in which exploitation is happening. So this is a kind of broader view, but it applies also to exploitation cases. I think that these kinds of cases actually also have implications for much deeper and higher order questions that we alluded to before. So for instance, the question, just as a matter of justice, should we in general prefer the optimization strategy, or should we prefer the non-deployment strategy? The kind of implication that we're seeing here is, well, we have to ask, are we moving towards the ideal of justice in a just way? That's the kind of key question. So is the transition itself just? Now, of course, there isn't a blanket answer to this question, and that's exactly the point. So this is why I think we have to be really skeptical of any sort of blanket argument in this domain. I think we have to make really context-specific judgments about deployability, and we need to be ready to revise those judgments as a kind of process of ethical and political critique as early and as often as possible, right? So scrutinizing these kinds of decision landscapes ultimately means shaping and contesting the decision-making agendas that we set for ourselves. Okay, so looking back to our case here, in the specific case, given that we're now trying to make a domain-specific judgment, I really think that the argument in favor of non-deployment is really bolstered by our analysis that exploitation was part and parcel of the optimization effort. So in this case, it seems like our path towards justice really involved distributing the burdens of optimization in a disproportionate way. So it involves a distribution that disadvantaged further people who are already disadvantaged by social structures of injustice. And so I think that's a really distinct normative reason not to deploy in that domain right now, even if the technological tool is not inherently flawed, as the kinds of tools that we discussed before when we discussed facial recognition tools that are used to infer behavioral characteristics from facial data. So I think one thing that we see in this case is that exploitation for the purpose of the greater good, right? So including the good of exploitees, we have this kind of mutually beneficial scenario. That is wrong because it's degrading and it takes an unfair advantage of exploitees. Specifically in that example, the fact that deception was used and the fact that vulnerable populations, especially vulnerable economically, were approached, that's kind of a clear indicator that we're taking both of these boxes. Also, exploitation of groups that are already structurally disadvantaged looks like it just risks further entrenching injustice, right? So yeah, perhaps only for a certain amount of time, but there's this concern that the transition path will further amplify an inequality in society that really shouldn't be amplified. Now you might think, well, actually people who are exploited in the situation have duties to themselves and to others to resist injustice and oppression. And you might think, well, one way of doing that is to actually volunteer to have your facial data recorded, right? You should cooperate with this optimization effort. But I actually don't think that things are quite as simple. I don't think that the mere fact that you're experiencing injustice means that you should subject yourself to exploitation voluntarily. So I think in order to make this kind of duty-based argument, a lot of other conditions would have to be in place. So I don't think that it's obvious that as a matter of duty, exploitees should just live with the fact that optimization is suboptimal for them. Okay, so here's the upshot. The first thing that we've seen is that on a very basic level, designing systems means making these really complex choices that all have some degree of ethical and political significance. Now, that includes the choice of how to deal with uncertainty and how to change our goals over time. So as we've seen, reflecting very seriously on transition from status quo A to status quo B really matters morally and politically. Then scrutinizing these decisional landscapes has turned out to have important implications for the question of whether we ought to deploy a given algorithmic tool in a given domain at all. So if optimizing for decision quality in a problem space P1 moves us further away from justice or some other important goal, we should choose to solve a different problem P2 instead, right? So, and that obviously means not deploying in that domain anymore and choosing to deploy in a different domain. And so I guess the surprising background view that stands behind that is that optimization can actually undermine justice, even though many people think that incremental optimization can't be bad because by definition, we're optimizing. It has actually turned out that that can be orthogonal to justice, whereas non-deployment itself can turn out to promote justice in a domain-specific way. Great, okay. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thanks a lot for the very good talk. So now we're going to take questions. So if anyone has a question about anything in the talk, please ask your questions.
Maybe I can ask a very specific question first. So in your A-leafs argument, I wasn't sure from how you described it. Is the concern that incorrect beliefs can result, or is the concern that unanticipated consequences can result, or is it something else entirely?
That's an excellent question. So the question is about, well, what exactly are A-leafs? What exactly is the kind of normative concern here? Is it more that we actually start believing things that are incorrect, or is the worry that collateral consequences ensue? I think the worry in a way is both of these things, but the basic worry is that we might have explicit beliefs that are in conflict with unstated assumptions that we have. So what philosophers talk about in that context is that our mental states include kind of arguments and claims that we might make. So if I ask you, what are some of your beliefs? You might tell me, well, I believe that justice requires this. But you might still have these unconscious biases. So I think that's maybe the term that is more familiar in other disciplines that can still inform your actions, right? So you might have certain emotional responses to certain scenarios, or you might have just other kind of connections that you're implicitly drawing that you aren't even aware of. And so that can not only mean that you will decide wrongly in a given decision scenario, it might also mean that once you've made a decision, you might wrongly evaluate what you've actually accomplished in making that decision, right? So if you gain new information by solving a decision problem, you might then adopt a number of explicit beliefs about what that means, right? So you might think, in the case that I mentioned in the talk, oh, okay, so now I know what people's recidivism risk rates are. But at the same time, you might have these belief-like mental states that might make you make other inferences about people who've been labeled as high risk that aren't actually coming out of that particular decision problem that you've solved. So it's a kind of concern about these implicit biases, and of course they can lead to these bad consequences, but in a way that the worry is kind of at a higher level. It's at the level of the decision maker, him or herself.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Do we have any other question or?
Hi, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I was curious about sort of what you ended on at the end, where you were discussing sort of the distinction between optimization and non-deployment. And it seems like in a world where the status quo is also unjust, there's substantial risks to not doing anything at all. And I'm wondering if you have some sort of thoughts on what the right guiding principle is. Like clearly utility can't be the end all be all because of exploitation. But then when should we act and when should we not act and how should we act seems like a question that's not quite addressed with sort of the sort of distinctions you were drawing at the end.
Right, so the question is, given that we're operating in a deeply unjust social world, surely we can't just not do anything at all. So I think that's a very reasonable concern. I don't think that non-deployment means doing nothing. So in choosing to not deploy, hopefully we have other strategies in place for dealing with the problems that we're diagnosing. So whenever we choose to not deploy, we need to have an argument about why we're not deploying. If the argument for non-deployment is the reason why we can't deploy here is because we think that optimization will be ineffective and it'll just further entrench kind of social problems that we're seeing, we need to have an alternative strategy in place that tries to address those social problems first before we use technology in that domain for specific purposes. Or maybe we have a different technological tool that we want to deploy instead. So that's the kind of first response to this concern. So non-deployment isn't the same as doing nothing. I completely agree that just doing nothing will just, perpetuate the existing status quo. I also think, though, that things aren't quite so simple, right? So other normative considerations might also apply. There may be social situations in which no matter what we do, we'll wrong somebody, right? And so I think that's actually maybe the intuition that you're picking up on, right? So it's not often the case that we can say, oh, we've deployed a tool here and that's unjust. So let's stop that and try to fix our social institutions. And that won't be objectionable at all. Very often it's more like, oh, we're choosing to not deploy this tool, but now we have to do this difficult task of, like finding a political solution to this problem somehow. And guess what? That's also not going to be optimal. So we're often dealing with these kinds of dirty hand scenarios where no matter what option we choose, we're committing some type of wrongdoing. But I think then we have to seriously think about the kind of distribution questions that pertain to that time of transition. So when it comes to adopting new solutions to a decision problem, whether they're technological or social and political, I think we can ask, well, are the main people who are burdened with the costs of this transition process, are they already disadvantaged or advantaged, right? So it might turn out that one alternative to exploitative optimization that involves the exploitation of those who are already experiencing injustice, one alternative could be for people who are already advantaged to incur particular disadvantages or to be treated in a way that is, pro tanto wrongful, but maybe all things considered justified. So I think it's not obvious that the burdens of this optimization process should always be distributed in quite the same way. And so scrutinizing that question, I think, helps us answer your question. Again, I think it'll be really domain specific. So I think it's really implausible to come up with the general higher order principle that is supposed to apply to healthcare, policing, education, transport, everything. Because I think the social problems and the available solutions are going to be really different. But that's kind of the basic view that I would advocate for.
Thanks.
I have a question about recognizing exploitation. You mentioned that even if individuals are benefiting, or if they have the choice to, or they have the informed consent about what data is used for, so if they believe it's not exploitation, it still might be exploitation. Then I guess the natural question is, like, who has the power to truly have the final say in terms of what is exploitation, especially from most of us who don't have the relevant philosophical backgrounds to decide, like, how do we recognize if our data collection process or general is exploitative?
So there's one easy solution to this question and a harder one. The easy solution is to appoint philosopher kings to deliberate on all of these questions and to give you the right answer. That's a bad idea, probably, because, as I've mentioned before, philosophers actually really disagree on that question. I've identified some overlapping kind of agreements. But bottom line is there isn't really a straightforward philosophical line on this question. It's by nature really philosophically and politically contested. I think the main point that you raised about disagreement on the parts of exploitees, of whether they're are in fact being exploited, is a really important one. So there are kind of parallel cases in non-technological domains. So for instance, surrogate mothers often feel that they're not being exploited, or at least they voluntarily opt into that kind of arrangement, but then maybe other people think, no, actually you are being exploited, you're in an economically vulnerable position and you're using your kind of very material bodily resources to benefit somebody else in a really meaningful way. Again, I don't think that when there is really hard disagreement like that, we can come up with a general line, right? So in, let's say, the surrogacy case, I think disagreement has been pretty entrenched for a really long time. So maybe that's an example of a domain where we can't come up with a kind of blanket don't do this rule. So not necessarily a non-deployment rule, but just, we can't ban it. But I wonder if in the Google subcontractor case, once all of these people learned what was happening, would the majority of them really doubt that they've been exploited? I'm not so sure. I mean, part of this is empirically contingent, right? So if somebody wanted to look into this, like we could have, kind of quantitative data on this question. And in fact, that might be very helpful in making policy decisions. But I find it very counterintuitive to imagine that a lot of these people are initially told, this is just an innocent game. And then somebody tells them later on, joke's on you, actually, we just paid you $5 to record really detailed data on a tool that is really bad for you and people like you. I think most people would kind of have the gut reaction, oh, that's really unfair. So I think that's actually quite a clear case where disagreements about that question are less likely to arise. But yeah, I mean, things might be different in other domains. So I'm not sure if I would have a kind of general principle for delineating that. I think in general, the people who should resolve this question, given that you also asked this kind of who should decide question, I think we need more democratic participation on this issue. So I think it's very bad for individual members of technology corporations to make judgment calls about what is exploitative. There are many different reasons why this is a bad idea. One very clear reason is that there is a profit motive. And so you shouldn't ask somebody with a profit motive if they're exploiting somebody. But also more generally, I think that putting much more democratic control over specifically deployment decisions would be beneficial. So I think we can learn a lot from the kind of democratic deliberations that were happening on a municipal level about facial recognition tools in policing. And we should apply similar models to other domains. I think there's a lot of promise in this kind of bottom-up approach.
All right, so it is 1 p.m. So I guess we don't really have time for questions anymore. But I would like to thank everyone for coming to this talk, and I would like to thank Dr. Zimmerman for giving us excellent talk. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for having me as a speaker. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.